A desperate puppy shivers at a doorstep as the worst blizzard in decades rages through the night. One man's split-second decision to open his door will unravel a mystery that nobody saw coming. When Nathan Wilson discovers the truth behind the abandoned puppy's past, everything changes. Who would leave this innocent creature to die in the cold? And what shocking secret will be revealed when Nathan digs deeper? This heartwarming journey of rescue, healing, and unexpected revelations will show how compassion can transform not just one life, but an entire community. Don't miss this extraordinary tale of second chances that will restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from today. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring true stories that show the best of human kindness. Nathan Wilson rubbed his tired eyes as he reviewed the final patient charts for the day. The veterinary clinic's emergency room had been unusually quiet, a rare blessing during Pinewood Falls' notoriously harsh winter season. Outside the windows of Paws Hearts Animal Clinic, snow swirled in hypnotic patterns, accumulating rapidly as the predicted blizzard intensified. The ancient heating system struggled against the plummeting temperatures, its metallic groans echoing through the empty waiting room. "You should head home, Nate," called Dr. Harriet Jenkins, the clinic's founder and head veterinarian, as she emerged from the supply closet. "That storm's only getting worse, and you've been on shift for nearly 14 hours. Nate nodded gratefully, his lanky frame unfolding from the reception desk chair. At 32, he was the clinic's most dedicated veterinary technician, often volunteering for the overnight emergency shifts that no one else wanted. The animals seemed to sense his natural compassion, even the most frightened ones calming under his gentle touch. "I'll lock up," he assured Dr. Jenkins, watching as she bundled herself in layers before braving the short walk to her car. The wind howled mournfully as she disappeared into the swirling white. Nate moved methodically through his closing routine, checking on the 3 overnight patients, a cat recovering from emergency surgery, an elderly dog with pneumonia, and a rabbit with digestive issues. He adjusted blankets, refreshed water, and spoke soft reassurances to each animal before turning down the main lights. The clinic's policy manual sat open on the desk, its pages dog-eared from frequent reference. The section highlighted in yellow caught his eye: emergency intake procedures must be followed for all strays, no exceptions. Nate knew the rules by heart. Document everything, check for microchips, report to animal control within 24 hours. Animals deemed too injured or aggressive for adoption would be euthanized once the mandatory 72-hour hold expired. He'd argued against this policy for years, but the clinic's limited resources and the county's strict regulations left little room for exceptions. Still, the thought of any animal being put down due to circumstances beyond their control made Nate's chest tighten with a familiar ache. Shrugging into his worn parka, Nate grabbed his keys and headed toward the back door. The staff parking lot would be a nightmare of snowdrifts by now, but his apartment was only 6 blocks away, a walkable distance even in this weather. As he pushed against the heavy metal door, the wind nearly knocked him backward, Arctic air slashing at any exposed skin. That's when he heard it, barely audible beneath the storm's fury, a high-pitched whimper followed by desperate scratching. Nate paused, tilting his head to locate the source. There it was again, coming from around the side of the building. Using his phone's flashlight, Nate trudged through knee-deep snow along the clinic's perimeter. The beam caught a small movement near the dumpsters, a tiny, quivering shape pressed against the brick wall, almost completely covered in snow. A puppy, no more than a few months old, stared up at him with wide, terrified eyes. The small creature's light brown fur was matted with ice, its slender body trembling violently. What looked like a frayed piece of rope was tangled around its neck, trailing in the snow behind it. Nate's heart constricted at the sight. The puppy was clearly malnourished. ribs visible even through its fur, and old scars crisscrossed its small body. When Nate crouched to examine it more closely, the puppy didn't growl or try to flee. It simply watched him with exhausted resignation, as if it had no fight left. The clinic's intake procedures flashed through Nate's mind. He should bring the puppy inside, document everything, place it in a kennel, and report it first thing in the morning. But looking at its condition, Nate knew exactly what would happen. The puppy would almost certainly be deemed too traumatized and potentially dangerous for adoption. Given the clinic's already stretched resources and the county shelter's overcrowding, euthanasia would be the likely outcome. Snow continued to accumulate around them as Nate weighed his options. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the puppy wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions. Despite everything, there was something in those eyes, not just fear, but an undimmed spark of life. "I can't leave you here," Nate whispered, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. "I just can't." In one swift motion, he removed his scarf and carefully wrapped it around the puppy's trembling body. The animal offered no resistance as Nate gently lifted it into his arms, cradling it against his chest for warmth. It weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and matted fur. The 6-block walk to his apartment felt endless as Nate hunched protectively over his precious cargo, shielding the puppy from the worst of the blizzard. By the time he reached his building, his fingers were numb despite his gloves, and his face burned from the cold. Nate's apartment above the old bookstore was modest but cozy, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with veterinary textbooks. The sudden warmth seemed to overwhelm the puppy as Nate gently placed it on a soft towel near the radiator. It remained completely still, eyes tracking his every movement with wary alertness. Grabbing his emergency medical kit, Nate knelt a respectful distance away, assessing the puppy's condition. Male, approximately 4 months old, severely undernourished, and showing signs of prolonged neglect and abuse. The rope around his neck had rubbed the skin raw in places, suggesting he'd been tied up for extended periods. A Labrador mix, Nate guessed, though it was hard to tell with his current condition. When Nate reached toward the rope, the puppy flinched, but made no sound. "Easy there," Nate murmured, keeping his movements slow and telegraphed. "I'm just going to take this off you. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The knot was tight, hardened by ice and grime. Nate worked it carefully with a pair of scissors, finally freeing the puppy from its tether. Next, he prepared a shallow bowl of lukewarm water and placed it within reach, followed by a small plate with soft, easily digestible food. The puppy made no move toward either, continuing to watch Nate with unwavering intensity. "It's okay," Nate said softly, settling cross-legged on the floor a few feet away. "Take your time." He continued talking in a gentle, steady stream, describing his day at the clinic, the interesting cases he'd handled, the rabbit that had finally started eating again. There was something therapeutic about filling the quiet apartment with calm. Words creating an atmosphere of normalcy in this decidedly abnormal situation. 2 hours passed, and still the puppy hadn't touched the food or water. Nate had nearly dozed off when a quiet lapping sound caught his attention. The puppy was drinking cautiously from the water bowl, taking small, measured sips while keeping one eye firmly on Nate. Nate remained perfectly still, not wanting to interrupt this small victory. When the puppy finished drinking, their eyes met across the room, and Nate felt something shift in the air between them. Not trust yet, but perhaps the fragile beginnings of it. "You need a name," Nate mused quietly. The puppy's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but showed no fear. Despite everything it had clearly been through, there was something undeniably resilient in its gaze. "Scout," Nate decided, "because you look like a survivor." That night, Nate slept on the couch, not wanting to leave Scout alone in strange surroundings. The puppy remained by the radiator, the towel rearranged into a makeshift nest. Several times during the night, Nate woke to check on him, relieved each time to see the steady rise and fall of Scout's breathing. Morning arrived with blinding whiteness as sunlight reflected off the fresh snow. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape, pristine and quiet. Nate woke to find Scout watching him from his place by the radiator, alert, but calmer than the night before. Moving with deliberate slowness, Nate refreshed Scout's water and prepared a new plate of food, this time with small pieces of boiled chicken mixed in. The aroma seemed to catch Scout's attention, his nose twitching slightly. "Give it a try," Nate encouraged, backing away to give Scout space. "It's good stuff, I promise." To Nate's delight, Scout cautiously approached the plate, sniffed the offering, and took a small piece of chicken. He retreated immediately to his safe spot, but continued eating, one small piece at a time. Nate smiled, mentally chalking up another victory. The morning brought practical concerns as well. Nate needed to check on the clinic's overnight patients, but he couldn't leave Scout alone in the apartment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Taking him to the clinic risked questions Nate wasn't ready to answer. His solution was imperfect. A quick call to Dr. Jenkins claiming he needed a personal day to deal with apartment repairs caused by the storm. "The roads are barely plowed." "Anyway," she agreed, "Olivia can cover your shift. Take care of your place, and we'll see you tomorrow." With that hurdle cleared, Nate turned his attention back to Scout. The previous night's emergency assessment had been limited by conditions and Scout's distress. Now Nate needed to conduct a more thorough examination if Scout would allow it. Sitting on the floor near Scout's corner, Nate began talking softly again, explaining what he wanted to do. "I need to check you over, buddy. Make sure you're not hurt anywhere I can't see." Scout watched him warily, but didn't retreat when Nate slowly extended his hand, palm up. For several long moments, they remained frozen in this tableau, Nate waiting, Scout assessing. Then, in a moment that made Nate's breath catch, Scout stretched his neck forward just enough to sniff Nate's fingertips. "Good boy," Nate whispered, fighting the urge to reach out and pet him. "We'll take this at your pace." Over the next hour, Nate conducted his examination in tiny increments, allowing Scout to set the boundaries. He discovered older injuries beneath the matted fur, healed fractures in 2 ribs, a notch taken out of one ear, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be small circular burn marks along his flanks. "Who did this to you?" Nate murmured, anger rising in his chest as he catalogued each sign of deliberate cruelty. Scout tensed at Nate's changed tone, and Nate immediately softened his voice. "Sorry, buddy. Not your fault. None of this is your fault." The day passed in a gentle rhythm of small interactions. By evening, Scout had eaten several small meals and had started to explore the apartment, though he kept a careful distance from Nate and startled at any sudden movement or noise. When Nate's phone rang, Scout immediately retreated to his safe corner, trembling. It was Olivia Chen, Nate's closest friend at the clinic and a talented veterinarian in her own right. "How's the apartment?" she asked without preamble. "Jenkins said you had some damage from the storm." "It's under control," Nate replied, watching Scout slowly emerge from his corner once the unfamiliar voice disappeared. "Thanks for covering my shift." "No problem. But listen, there's something you should know. We had someone come in today asking about a missing dog, a lab mix puppy." Nate's heart sank. "Who was asking?" "Some guy named Victor Reeves said his valuable hunting dog ran away during the storm, offered a reward for information." Olivia paused significantly. "Nate, he didn't seem like the typical worried pet owner. Jenkins told him we hadn't seen any strays, but he left his number anyway." Did he describe the dog? Nate asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Light brown lab mix, male, about 4 months old. Had a rope collar. Another pause. Nate, what aren't you telling me? I'll explain tomorrow, Nate promised. Just, Andy, if he comes back, call me right away, okay? After hanging up, Nate looked at Scout with troubled eyes. Someone was looking for him. Someone who had likely inflicted those scars and burns. The thought of returning Scout to such a person made Nate physically ill. His decision solidified in that moment. No matter what, he would protect Scout from going back to a situation of abuse. He'd figure out the details later, but the commitment crystallized in his heart with absolute certainty. That night, Nate tried something new. Instead of leaving Scout in his corner, he placed the towel near the couch where Nate slept. To his surprise, Scout approached cautiously, circled the makeshift bed 3 times, then settled onto it with a small sigh. Though still maintaining a safe distance, Scout had chosen to sleep closer to Nate, a tiny victory that felt monumental. "Good night, Scout," Nate whispered into the darkened room. "Tomorrow will be better." The following days established a tentative routine. Nate returned to work, arranging his schedule for shorter shifts so Scout wouldn't be alone too long. He purchased proper dog supplies, a comfortable bed, nutritious food, toys that Scout approached with adorable confusion, as if he'd never seen such things before. At the clinic, Nate kept his ears open for any mention of Victor Reeves, tension coiling in his stomach each time the front door opened. Olivia watched him with knowing eyes, but asked no direct questions, respecting his privacy while offering silent support. A week after finding Scout, Nate was rewarded with a breakthrough. He'd been reading on the couch, Scout resting on his new bed nearby, when he felt a gentle pressure against his leg. Looking down, he found Scout leaning hesitantly. Against him, dark eyes watching for any negative reaction. Moving with exquisite slowness, Nate lowered his hand to rest on the floor beside Scout, palm up. Seconds stretched into minutes as Scout considered this offering. Then, with deliberate care, Scout moved his head under Nate's hand, initiating contact for the first time. Nate held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as Scout pressed briefly against his palm before withdrawing. The moment was fleeting, but its significance was enormous. A conscious choice, a fragile bridge of trust spanning the gap between them. "Thank you," Nate whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As days turned into weeks, Scout's physical transformation was remarkable. Regular meals filled out his frame, and his coat grew glossy with health. The psychological changes were slower but equally profound. The puppy who had once flinched at every movement now followed Nate from room to room, his confidence growing incrementally with each positive experience. Scout's first walk outside was a tentative affair, the puppy pressing close to Nate's legs as they navigated the quiet early morning streets. A car backfiring sent Scout into a panic, his body trembling as he tried to hide behind Nate. Kneeling in the snow, Nate spoke reassurances until Scout's breathing steadied, never forcing him to move until he was ready. "The world can be scary," Nate acknowledged, gently stroking Scout's ears, "but we'll face it together, one step at a time." Olivia became a regular visitor to Nate's apartment, her expertise invaluable in Scout's rehabilitation. During one such visit, as they watched Scout cautiously exploring a new toy, she voiced the concern Nate had been avoiding. "You need to report him, Nate, officially. What happens if this Reeves guy tracks him down? You could lose your job, face. Legal troubles." Nate's jaw tightened. "You've seen his scars, Liv. You know what would happen if he went back to that." "I'm not saying return him," Olivia clarified, her dark eyes serious. "I'm saying document everything properly. Build a case. If Reeves tries to claim Scout, you'll need legal standing to protect him." She was right, and Nate knew it. The next day, He photographed all of Scout's injuries, compiled his medical observations, and contacted a friend at Animal Control who could be trusted to handle the situation discreetly. The paperwork was filed, documenting Scout as a rescued stray with signs of abuse, currently in foster care pending investigation. It was a step toward legitimacy, but Nate couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough if Victor Reeves decided to pursue his claim. The man had resources and connections in Pinewood Falls. Nate had done some research and discovered Reeves owned significant property outside town and was known for his hunting dogs, which frequently won regional competitions. 3 weeks after finding Scout, Nate's fears materialized in the clinic parking lot. He was leaving after his shift when a mud-splattered pickup truck pulled in, blocking his path. A tall man with a weather-beaten face and cold eyes stepped out, moving with deliberate confidence. "You Wilson?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and sharp. Nate nodded, instantly alert to the potential threat. "Can I help you?" "Name's Victor Reeves. Heard you might know something about my dog. Brown lab mix went missing during the big storm. Valuable hunting prospect from championship bloodlines." Every muscle in Nate's body tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about your dog." Reeves studied him with narrowed eyes. "Funny, because word around town is you've got a new puppy that matches that description perfectly. Found him right around the time mine went missing." "Lots of lab mixes in the world," Nate replied evenly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "The dog I'm fostering was found abandoned, half-frozen, and showing signs of significant abuse. Animal Control has all the documentation." Something dangerous flashed in Reeves's eyes. "Calling me an animal abuser, Wilson? That's a serious accusation." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything." Nate maintained his calm demeanor, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm just stating facts about the dog in my care." Reeves stepped closer, his larger frame looming over Nate. "I train hunting dogs. Sometimes training requires discipline, doesn't make it abuse." The casual justification made Nate's blood boil, but he kept his voice steady. "We clearly have different definitions of discipline." "This isn't over," Reeves warned, turning back toward his truck. "That dog is valuable property, and I intend to get him back." As Reeves drove away, Nate remained rooted to the spot, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The confrontation confirmed his worst fears. Scout's former owner was not only looking for him, but felt entitled to continue the abuse under the guise of training. Nate pulled out his phone with shaking hands, calling Olivia. "Reeves found me," he told her without preamble. "He's claiming Scout is his valuable property and wants him back." "Come to my place," Olivia insisted. "Bring Scout. We need to figure this out." That evening, seated in Olivia's small kitchen with Scout curled protectively against his leg, Nate felt the full weight of the situation descend upon him. If Reeves could prove ownership through registration papers or microchip records they hadn't detected, Nate had no legal grounds to keep Scout. "We need to dig deeper," Olivia declared, her usual pragmatic self taking charge. "Find out if there have been previous complaints against Reeves, talk to people who know about his training methods, gather evidence." "And if that's not enough?" Nate asked quietly, his hand resting protectively on Scout's head. "Then we fight," Olivia stated simply. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a stand, even when the odds are against you." The following weeks transformed Nate's life into a careful balance of work, Scout's care, and covert investigation. Olivia utilized her extensive network in the veterinary community, contacting colleagues who might have treated Reeves's dogs. Nate spoke with former employees of Reeves' hunting operation, piecing together a disturbing pattern of mistreatment hidden beneath a veneer of championship success. Scout continued to flourish under Nate's care, his personality emerging more each day, playful, intelligent, and surprisingly gentle. He still had moments of fear, particularly around loud noises or sudden movements, but his resilience was remarkable. When Nate returned home each day, Scout greeted him with increasing enthusiasm, tail wagging and eyes bright with recognition. The threat of Reeves loomed constantly. Twice more he approached Nate, once at the grocery store and once outside his apartment building, each encounter more menacing than the last. Nate installed security cameras around his apartment and varied his routines, never walking Scout along. The same route twice. 5 weeks after finding Scout, Olivia burst into the clinic during Nate's shift, her expression triumphant. "We've got something," she announced, pulling him into an empty exam room. "Remember Jake from the regional veterinary conference last year? He worked for a clinic near Reeves' property 3 years ago. They documented multiple cases of suspicious injuries in Reeves' dogs, but nothing ever came of the reports because Reeves claimed they were training accidents." "That's horrible, but I'm not sure how it helps us now," Nate said, frustration evident in his voice. "Because," Olivia continued excitedly, "Jake kept copies of all the medical records. And get this, there's a pattern of young dogs coming in with injuries, then suddenly running away or dying in training accidents if they didn't perform to Reeves' standards. Jake thinks Reeves has been cycling through puppies, discarding the ones that don't show immediate promise." The implications made Nate's stomach turn. So Scout wasn't lost in the storm. He was abandoned because he wasn't performing well enough. Exactly, and Jake's willing to testify about the pattern he observed. It might not be enough to press criminal charges, but it could help us prove abandonment, which would invalidate any ownership claim. For the first time in weeks, Nate felt a glimmer of hope. They now had something concrete, a documented pattern that supported their suspicions about Scout's treatment and abandonment. That hope was shattered 3 days later when Nate returned. Home to find his apartment door ajar, the lock broken. Heart pounding, he rushed inside, calling for Scout. The apartment was in disarray, furniture overturned, Scout's bed empty. On the kitchen table lay a handwritten note. "Took back what's mine, stay out of it if you know what's good for you." The world seemed to collapse around Nate as he stood in his violated home, the absence of Scout a physical ache in his chest. He called Olivia, his voice breaking as he explained what had happened, then contacted the police to report the break-in and dog napping. The responding officers were sympathetic, but not optimistic. Without clear proof of ownership, the situation fell into a gray area of property disputes. They promised to visit Reeves' property, but warned Nate not to expect much. "The law sees pets as property," the officer explained gently. "Without registration papers in your name or clear evidence of criminal abuse, it's basically your word against his." Nate sat on his couch long after the police left, surrounded by the remnants of Scout's presence. A chew toy under the coffee table, a water bowl in the kitchen, the bed that still held the impression of Scout's body. The thought of Scout back, in Reeves' hands, confused and frightened, possibly facing punishment for his escape, was unbearable. His phone rang shortly after midnight. Olivia, her voice urgent. "The police just left Reeves' property. They said they saw dogs in outdoor kennels, but couldn't find one matching Scout's description. Reeves claimed he hasn't seen the dog and suggested you made up the break-in for attention." "He's lying," Nate said, certainty hardening his voice. "Scout is there somewhere, probably hidden away until the heat dies down." "I know," Olivia agreed. "That's why I'm parked half a mile from Reeves' property right now. There's a dirt access road that runs behind his kennel area. If we're quick and careful, we might be able to see if Scout is there." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Nate said, already reaching for his keys. The night was moonless and cold as Nate and Olivia made their way through the woods behind Reeves' property. Using only the dimmest setting on their phone flashlights, they navigated toward the sound of dogs barking in the distance. Breaking through the tree line, they found themselves looking down at a series of outdoor kennels, each containing a dog. Beyond these was a larger building, likely Reeves's main kennel facility. 2 security lights illuminated the yard between structures, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. "I don't see Scout in those outdoor runs," Olivia whispered, scanning the kennels with a small pair of binoculars. "He must be inside the building." Nate's hands clenched into fists as frustration and helplessness washed over him. They couldn't break into the building. That would be criminal trespassing, potentially destroying any legal case they might build. But leaving without Scout seemed equally impossible. A sudden commotion from the main house caught their attention. Lights flicked on, and the distinctive sound of a truck engine starting rumbled through the night. Moments later, Reeves' pickup emerged from the garage, headlights cutting through the darkness as it headed down the long driveway toward town. "He's leaving," Olivia whispered, excitement edging her voice. "This might be our chance to at least look through the windows, see if Scout is inside." They waited until the truck's taillights disappeared before making their way cautiously down the slope toward the kennel building. The dogs in the outdoor runs barked at their approach, but the sound was common enough on the property that it didn't seem to trigger any alarms. Reaching the main building, they moved from window to window, Nate's heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give them away. Most of the interior was dark, but a single light burned in what appeared to be an office area. Through that window, they could see rows of kennels, most containing sleeping dogs. "There!" Olivia's urgent whisper drew Nate's attention to a kennel in the far corner. Huddled at the back, barely visible in the dim light, was a small form with light brown fur. As they watched, the dog raised its head, and even from this distance, Nate recognized Scout's distinctive white chest marking. "It's him," Nate confirmed, a mixture of relief and rage flooding through him. Scout was alive but confined in a small kennel, looking withdrawn and frightened, a stark contrast to the confident, playful dog he'd become in Nate's care. Before they could decide on their next move, headlights swept across the property. Reeves was returning far sooner than expected. Nate and Olivia barely made it back to the tree line before the truck pulled up to the main house. "We need to call the police now," Olivia insisted once they were safely back at her car. "We've confirmed Scout is there, being held against his will." "And tell them what? That we were trespassing on private property?" Nate's voice was bitter with frustration. "We still don't have proof that Reeves abandoned Scout or that he's being mistreated now." Olivia grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Yes, we do. I recorded everything on my phone. The conditions of those outdoor kennels, the cramped spaces, and most importantly, Scout's reaction when he saw us. That's not a dog who wants to be there, Nate. That's a dog who's terrified." With renewed determination, they drove straight to the police station, where they presented the video evidence along with Jake's compiled medical records. The officer on duty, initially skeptical, became increasingly concerned as he reviewed the materials. "This isn't conclusive proof of criminal abuse," he admitted, "but there's enough here to justify another visit with animal control present, especially since you've now confirmed the dog is indeed on the property after Mr. Reeves denied having him." The next morning, Nate and Olivia joined 2 police officers and an animal control representative as they approached Reeves's property, with a warrant to inspect all animals on the premises. Reeves met them at the door, his face contorted with anger. "This is harassment," he spat as the officers presented the warrant. "I run a legitimate business here." "Then you should have nothing to worry about," the animal control officer replied calmly, rushing past him toward the kennel building. The inspection was thorough, documenting conditions that, while not criminally neglectful, certainly raised concerns about animal welfare. When they reached Scout's kennel, the puppy pressed himself against the back wall, trembling, until he caught sight of Nate. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. Scout's tail began to wag frantically and he whined, pressing against the kennel door in a desperate attempt to reach Nate. "The dog doesn't know you," Reeves insisted, but the lie fell flat in the face of Scout's obvious recognition. The animal control officer observed the interaction with interest. "Mr. Reeves, do you have any documentation proving ownership of this particular dog? Registration papers, vaccination records, purchase receipts?" Reeves faltered, his confident facade cracking slightly. "He's from one of my breeding pairs. I don't keep paperwork on every puppy." "Convenient," Olivia muttered under her breath. The officer turned to Nate. "And you have documentation of finding this dog abandoned during the blizzard 5 weeks ago? Medical records of his condition when found?" Nate nodded, pulling out his phone to show the photographs and notes he'd compiled, along with the official report filed with animal control. While the evidence wasn't conclusive either way, the combination of Scout's obvious preference for Nate, the documented pattern of suspicious injuries and disappearances in Reeves's kennel, and Reeves's inability to provide any proof of legitimate ownership tipped the scales. The animal control officer made her decision. "We're removing this dog from the premises pending further investigation," she announced, signaling to Nate to retrieve Scout from the kennel. "Mr. Reeves, you will have the opportunity to present evidence of ownership at a hearing should you choose to pursue this matter." The relief that flooded through Nate as Scout leaped into his arms was overwhelming. The puppy trembled with excitement, covering Nate's face with frantic licks as if afraid they might be separated again. Reeves watched with barely contained rage, but made no move to stop them as they left his property, Scout safely secured in Nate's arms. The subsequent weeks brought a flurry of legal proceedings. True to his threatening nature, Reeves filed a claim for Scout's return, but his case quickly unraveled. 3 former employees came forward with testimony about his training methods, describing techniques that crossed well beyond the line into abuse. Jake's medical records painted a damning picture of neglect and suspicious injuries. Most convincingly, Scout's behavior, his fear responses to certain stimuli, his clear attachment to Nate, and his obvious terror around Reeves spoke volumes to the judge overseeing the case. When the ruling finally came, granting Nate permanent custody and issuing a restraining order preventing Reeves from approaching either Nate or Scout, the courtroom erupted in applause. The case had drawn attention throughout Pinewood Falls, with many community members rallying around Nate and Scout's cause. More significant than the custody ruling were the conditions imposed on Reeves' kennel operations: mandatory inspections, limitations on training methods, and requirements for proper documentation of all animals in his care. It wasn't enough, in Nate's opinion, but it was a start toward preventing other dogs from suffering Scout's fate. 6 months after finding Scout shivering in the snow, Nate stood at the edge of a sunlit meadow, watching as Scout raced joyfully through the tall grass, playfully chasing butterflies. The transformation was extraordinary, from a terrified, abused puppy to this confident, happy dog whose trust had been fully restored. The meadow was part of Second Chance Ranch, a rehabilitation facility for rescued animals that had grown from an idea born during those dark days of Scout's abduction. Using donations from community members touched by Scout's story, Nate and Olivia had purchased a small property on the outskirts of Pinewood Falls, converting it into a sanctuary where abused and neglected animals could heal at their own pace. Dr. Jenkins had been the first to offer professional support, volunteering her services 1 weekend a month. Other veterinarians and animal behaviorists soon followed, drawn by the mission and the remarkable success stories emerging from the ranch. Scout, once a victim, had become an unofficial therapy dog, his gentle presence calming newly rescued animals and showing them by example that trust was possible. Nate's phone buzzed with a notification. Another donation had come in, this one large enough to expand the ranch's small medical facility. Since Scout's story had been featured in regional news, support had poured in from unexpected places, each contribution expanding what was possible at Second Chance. As Scout bounded back to Nate's side, tongue lolling in a happy canine grin, Nate felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The journey from that frozen night behind the clinic to this moment had been filled with challenges, but watching Scout now, healthy, confident, and trusting, made every difficult step worthwhile. "Good boy," Nate murmured, ruffling the soft fur between Scout's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, eyes half closing in contentment. These simple moments of connection still amazed Nate, especially knowing how hard won they had been. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Olivia's blue sedan appeared on the winding driveway that led to the main building of Second Chance Ranch. Scout's ears perked up, his tail wagging in recognition as she emerged from the car, carrying a stack of files and her veterinary bag. "Special delivery," she called, making her way toward them through the meadow. The test results came back for the new arrivals. Mostly good news, though the shepherd mix will need another round of antibiotics. Since opening the ranch 6 months ago, they had taken in 23 animals, mostly dogs, but also a few cats and even a neglected miniature horse. Each arrival brought new challenges and eventually new triumphs. The work was demanding, but deeply fulfilling in a way Nate had never experienced before. "Also," Olivia continued, a hint of excitement creeping into her voice, "I heard from that reporter at the regional newspaper. She wants to do a follow-up piece on Scout and the ranch. Apparently, the first article generated their biggest reader response in years." Nate nodded thoughtfully, watching Scout investigate a nearby butterfly with gentle curiosity. "If it helps bring attention to animal abuse and what we're doing here, I'm all for it." They walked together toward the main building, a converted farmhouse that now served as the ranch's headquarters. Scout trotted ahead, occasionally circling back as if to ensure they were following. The transformation in him from victimized puppy to confident dog still struck Nate as nothing short of miraculous. Inside, the farmhouse bustled with activity. 2 volunteers were socializing with a recently rescued border collie, using the gentle techniques Nate had developed based on his experience with Scout. In the medical room, Dr. Jenkins was examining the elder tabby cat they'd taken in after its owner passed away. The atmosphere was purposeful but peaceful, exactly what Nate had envisioned when he first dreamed of creating this sanctuary. "Nate," Dr. Jenkins called, spotting him in the doorway. "Come look at this." She gestured him over to examine the X-rays displayed on her tablet. "Remember how we thought Whiskers here might have arthritis? It's actually an old fracture that never healed properly. With the right treatment, we should be able to improve his mobility significantly." As Nate bent to study the images, Scout circled the examination table, his behavior catching Dr. Jenkins' attention. "It's remarkable," she commented, watching Scout gently nuzzle the nervous cat. "He seems to understand exactly what these animals need, when to approach, when to give space. He's a natural therapy dog." Nate smiled, pride warming his chest. He remembers what it's like to be scared. "I think that's why he's so good at this." The day continued in its usual rhythm of treatments, training sessions, and administrative work. By late afternoon, Nate was reviewing applications from families interested in adopting some of their rehabilitated animals. The ranch's policy was strict but fair, thorough home checks, multiple meetings with the animal, and ongoing support after adoption. Not everyone appreciated the rigorous process, but those who understood their mission were willing to comply. As Nate considered a particularly promising application for a gentle retriever named Cooper, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar local number. "Hello, this is Nathan Wilson," he answered, expecting perhaps a new volunteer or donor. "Mr. Wilson, The voice was female, professional, and unfamiliar. "This is Ellen Montgomery from Pinewood Falls Animal Control. I'm calling about a situation that may interest you, given your work at Second Chance Ranch." Nate straightened in his chair, instantly alert. "What kind of situation?" "We've just executed a warrant on a property about 15 miles outside town. The conditions were concerning. Multiple dogs in various states of neglect, some showing signs of abuse. The owner claims they're hunting dogs in training, but..." She paused, her professional tone slipping slightly to reveal genuine distress. "Some of these animals haven't been fed properly in weeks. 3 have injuries consistent with fighting." Nate's stomach tightened. "How many dogs are we talking?" "About 12 that we've found so far. We're still searching the property. The county shelter is already at capacity, and these dogs will need specialized care before they can be considered for adoption. Your facility was mentioned as a possible placement option." The request wasn't unexpected. Second Chance Ranch had developed a reputation for handling difficult cases, but 12 new animals at once would strain their resources significantly. Nate glanced through the window at their existing residence, mentally calculating space, supplies, and staff capabilities. "We can take them," he decided, "but we'll need support. Volunteers, donations, maybe some temporary fosters for our more stable residents to make room." "I was hoping you'd say that," Ellen replied, relief evident in her voice. "I'll have my team transport them to you tomorrow morning. And Mr. Wilson, there's something else you should know. The property belongs to Victor Reeves." The name hit Nate like a physical blow. Victor Reeves, the man who had abused Scout, who had broken into Nate's apartment to steal him back, who had fought them in court with vicious determination. Despite the restraining order and increased oversight of his operations, Reeves had apparently continued his cruel practices, just more carefully hidden. "What happened?" Nate asked, his voice tight. "What led to the warrant?" "One of his dogs escaped," Ellen explained. "A chocolate lab. It was found by hikers, severely malnourished and injured. When they brought it to us, we recognized signs of systematic abuse similar to what was documented in your case with Scout. That gave us enough to request a warrant." After ending the call, Nate sat motionless, processing the information. Scout, sensing his distress, padded over and rested his head on Nate's knee. The warm weight anchored him, reminding him of what truly mattered. Not revenge against Reeves, but helping the animals who had suffered at his hands. That evening, Nate called an emergency meeting with Olivia, Dr. Jenkins, and their core volunteers. The ranch's cozy conference room, formerly the farmhouse dining room, quickly filled with concerned faces as Nate explained the situation. 12 new arrivals, all with varying degrees of neglect or abuse, all coming from Victor Reeves's property, he concluded. "They'll be here tomorrow morning." "We'll need to reorganize completely," Olivia said practically, already making notes on her tablet. "Move some of the stable dogs to the outdoor runs, convert the sunroom to temporary housing, maybe set up additional kennels in the barn." "I can call in some colleagues to help with initial assessments," Dr. Jenkins offered. "We'll need a full workup on each dog, blood work, x-rays for any suspected fractures, dental exams." The logistics were daunting, but as the team worked through them, Nate felt a surge of determination. This was exactly why they had created Second Chance Ranch, to provide sanctuary and healing for animals who had nowhere else to turn. If they could rehabilitate Scout, they could help these dogs too. The planning session stretched late into the evening. When the last volunteer had left, promising to return early the next morning, Nate and Olivia remained at the kitchen table, Scout dozing at their feet. "It's strange," Nate said quietly, turning his coffee mug between his hands. "In a twisted way, we owe all of this to Reeves. If he hadn't abused and abandoned Scout, if he hadn't fought us so viciously for custody, none of this would exist." He gestured around at the ranch that had become their life's work. Olivia considered this, her expression thoughtful. Maybe, or maybe you would have found another way to do this work. Some people are just meant to heal what others break. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning as the animal control vans pulled into the ranch's driveway. Nate, Olivia, and a team of volunteers stood ready, arrangements complete for receiving their new residents. Scout sat alertly at Nate's side, his usual position when new animals arrived. Ellen Montgomery supervised as her officers carefully unloaded the first crates. The dogs inside varied in size and breed, but all showed signs of neglect. Dull coats, visible ribs, fearful postures. Some growled defensively, others cowered at the backs of their crates, while a few watched with the wary calculation of animals who had learned to expect cruelty. "This is all of them?" Nate asked, surveying. The 12 crates now arranged in the receiving area. Ellen shook her head, her expression grim. "There's one more. We saved him for last because he's in the worst condition. He's also the one whose escape led to the warrant." She gestured to an officer who was carefully lifting a larger crate from the back of the van. Inside was a chocolate Labrador, his once powerful frame now skeletal, his coat patchy with bare spots that revealed old scars and newer wounds. Most disturbing were his eyes, dull with exhaustion, but still smoldering with a defiance that spoke of a spirit not yet broken despite everything he had endured. Nate felt his throat tighten with emotion as he knelt beside the crate, speaking softly to its occupant. "Hey there. Big guy, you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The dog regarded him without reaction, too exhausted or too distrustful to respond. Beside Nate, Scout approached cautiously, sniffing at the crate with evident interest. To everyone's surprise, the Labrador's tail thumped weakly against the crate floor, just once but unmistakably. "Well, looks like Scout approves," Olivia remarked, already preparing a comfortable space in their intensive care area. "What's his name?" Ellen consulted her paperwork. According to Reeves's records, he's called Gunner. 3 years old, supposedly one of his prized hunting dogs until recently. Until he stopped performing to Reeves's standards, Nate guessed, anger flaring briefly before he tamped it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help these animals. The morning passed in a flurry of activity as each dog received an initial health assessment and was settled into appropriate temporary housing. Gunner, as the most severely compromised, was placed in their intensive care space with constant monitoring. His condition was concerning. Dehydration, malnutrition, infected wounds, and possible internal injuries all required immediate attention. By mid-afternoon, Nate found himself sitting beside Gunner's bed, carefully monitoring the IV fluids and antibiotics Dr. Jenkins had prescribed. Scout lay nearby, his eyes rarely leaving the older dog. There was something about Gunner that drew Nate particularly, perhaps the defiance still visible despite his condition, or perhaps the way he had responded, however slightly, to Scout's presence. "You know what it's like in that place, don't you?" Nate murmured to Scout. "You understand what he's been through." Scout's ears twitched at Nate's voice, but his attention remained fixed on Gunner, as if standing guard over a fallen comrade. The connection between the two dogs, one successfully rescued and rehabilitated, the other just beginning that journey, struck Nate as profoundly meaningful. As days turned into weeks, the ranch adjusted to its expanded population. Most of the rescued dogs began responding to proper care and gentle handling. Some, particularly the younger ones, showed remarkable resilience, their natural dog behaviors emerging once they understood they were safe. Others remained cautious, progress measured in tiny increments, a tail that no longer tugged constantly, eyes that could maintain contact for moments longer, a willingness to approach for food, rather than waiting fearfully in corners. Gunner's physical recovery proceeded more slowly than they had hoped. While his wounds healed and his strength gradually returned, he remained distant, tolerating human contact without seeking it. The only exception was Scout, whose presence seemed to comfort the older dog. They often found Gunnar watching Scout's interactions with humans, studying how the younger dog had learned to trust. One evening, about 3 weeks after the dog's arrival, Nate was working late in the office when a commotion erupted from the main kennel area. Heart racing, he rushed to investigate, fearing a fight among the more reactive dogs. Instead, he found Olivia standing motionless in the doorway, her expression one of stunned surprise. Following her gaze, Nate froze at the unexpected sight. Gunnar, who had been cleared for limited movement that morning, had somehow managed to open his kennel door. Instead of attempting escape, however, he had made his way to Scout's bed and was curled up beside the younger dog, their bodies pressed together in mutual comfort. "He's never voluntarily approached another dog before," Olivia whispered, careful not to disturb the moment. "We thought he might be permanently dog-aggressive after what he's been through." Nate watched the two dogs, Scout trustingly asleep, Gunnar alert but relaxed, and felt a surge of hope. "I think he sees something in Scout. Maybe recognizes their shared experience. If Scout can be happy and trusting after what happened, maybe Gunnar is realizing he can be too." This small breakthrough marked a turning point in Gunnar's rehabilitation. Though still wary with humans, he began following Scout's example more openly, watching how the younger dog interacted with the ranch staff and gradually attempting similar behaviors himself. When Scout allowed Nate to check his ears, Gunnar would cautiously permit the same. When Scout eagerly participated in gentle training exercises, Gunnar would observe intently before attempting the same tasks, albeit with more hesitation. "It's like Scout is teaching him how to be a dog again," Dr. Jenkins remarked, watching this dynamic with professional interest. "I've seen therapy dogs work wonders before, but there's something special about this connection. They speak a language we can't fully access." As Gunnar's physical health improved, Nate began including him in Scout's daily routines, supervised walks around the property, quiet time in the meadow, even brief interactions with some of the more stable new residents. Each new experience was carefully managed to prevent overwhelming Gunnar, but his confidence grew steadily, his eyes gradually losing their dullness and regaining a spark of canine curiosity. The most significant moment came unexpectedly. Nearly 2 months after Gunnar's arrival, Nate was sitting on the porch steps one evening, Scout beside him as usual, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. He was aware of Gunnar observing from the doorway, as he often did, close enough to see but far enough to retreat if uncomfortable. Lost in thought about the ranch's future plans, Nate absently extended his hand to scratch Scout's ears. The familiar gesture was so routine that he didn't immediately register the unfamiliar texture beneath his fingers. When realization struck, he held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Gunnar had silently approached and placed himself under Nate's hand, initiating physical contact for the first time. The chocolate lab stood rigid, clearly uncertain about his own action, but he didn't pull away. His eyes, now much more expressive than when he'd arrived, held a mixture of fear and something like hope, as if testing whether this human's gentleness extended to him as well. "Hey, Gunnar," Nate said softly, keeping his hand motionless. On the dog's head. "This is new, isn't it?" Beside them, Scout watched with what Nate could have sworn was approval. After several long moments, Gunnar exhaled deeply and leaned slightly into Nate's touch before retreating to a comfortable distance. Not fleeing, simply restoring his preferred space. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute, but its significance was enormous. That night, Nate called Olivia to share the breakthrough, his voice still thick with emotion. "He chose to approach me, Liv. He made that decision himself." "That's huge," she agreed. 2 months ago, I wouldn't have believed it was possible, not with how shut down he was. "But I think we have Scout to thank." Nate said, glancing at the younger dog who was currently curled up on his dog bed, peaceful in sleep. Gunnar needed to see living proof that humans could be trusted. The following weeks brought more progress, not just with Gunnar, but with all the dogs rescued from Reeves's property. Several of the less traumatized ones were deemed ready for adoption, carefully matched with experienced owners who understood their special needs. Each successful placement was celebrated by the ranch staff, though always with a bittersweet edge. Joy at seeing an animal find a loving home, mixed with the natural attachment that had formed during their care. Gunnar continued his slow journey toward trust, each day bringing small victories. He began joining group training sessions, learned to play fetch, though he still startled at sudden movements, and eventually allowed the entire staff to handle him for medical care without signs of distress. His physical transformation was as remarkable as his behavioral one, his coat now glossy and full, his frame powerful rather than emaciated, his movements fluid and confident. 4 months after the rescue, as Nate was updating the ranch's files, he came across Gunnar's intake. Photos. The contrast between those images and the dog who now napped peacefully in the office with Scout was stark enough to be almost unbelievable. Nate found himself studying the before and after, marveling at the resilience that allowed such healing. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Through the window, he spotted Ellen Montgomery's animal control vehicle pulling up. She visited regularly to check on the rescued dog's progress and to discuss other potential cases, but her expression today seemed unusually serious. "Ellen," Nate greeted her as she entered. "Everything okay?" She sighed heavily, accepting the offered chair. "Yes and no. I have news about Victor Reeves. The district attorney has decided to pursue criminal charges based on the evidence we gathered during the raid. Multiple counts of animal cruelty, negligence, and failure to provide adequate care." And Nate took a moment to process this information. "That's good news, isn't it? Why do you seem concerned?" "Because Reeves's lawyer is already fighting back hard. They're claiming the dogs were in acceptable condition for working animals, that any injuries were normal for hunting dogs, and that we exaggerated the conditions to justify the seizure." She ran a hand through her short grey hair, frustration evident. "The DA wants to know if you'd be willing to testify. You have more experience with Reeves' methods than anyone, given what happened with Scout." The request wasn't unexpected, but it still sent a ripple of unease through Nate. Testifying meant facing Reeves again, revisiting the darkest moments of Scout's ordeal, opening himself to public scrutiny and potentially vicious cross-examination. "What about the evidence?" he asked. "The photos, the medical reports, all important," Ellen agreed. "But juries respond to stories, to emotional truths. Scout's journey from that freezing night to becoming the therapy dog who helped rehabilitate the very animals rescued from his former abuser. That's compelling in a way medical charts aren't." Scout, hearing his name, trotted over to place his head on Nate's knee. Gunnar watched from his bed, alert but relaxed in a way that would have been impossible months ago. Looking at them both, visible proof of recovery and resilience, Nate felt his hesitation dissolve. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes to make sure Reeves can't hurt any more animals." Ellen's relief was palpable. "Thank you. The DA will be in touch about specifics. It probably won't go to trial for several months, but they'll want to prepare you thoroughly." After she left, Nate remained at his desk, mulling over this new development. The prospect of a criminal trial brought both hope and anxiety. Hope that Reeves would finally face real consequences, anxiety about reopening wounds that had begun to heal. That evening, as Nate sat on the porch with Scout and Gunnar beside him, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here. From that single impulsive decision to take Scout home during a blizzard to now running a rehabilitation ranch with dozens of animals and staff, from being a lone technician breaking rules to save one puppy to potentially helping prosecute one of the region's most notorious animal abusers. The transformation seemed almost as remarkable as Scout's own. Olivia found him there as dusk settled over the property, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Without a word, she sat beside him on the step, understanding in her silence. "Ellen told me about the trial," she said finally. "How do you feel about testifying?" Nate considered the question carefully. Nervous, Reeves isn't someone who forgives being challenged, but also certain. This is why we're here, isn't it? To speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Scout shifted to rest his head on Nate's lap, those expressive eyes gazing up with complete trust. Even Gunner moved closer, not quite seeking contact, but demonstrating a comfort with proximity that would have been unthinkable months before. "Look at them," Olivia murmured. "They've come so far, especially Gunner. Remember how we weren't even sure he could be rehabilitated?" Nate nodded, remembering the skeletal defensive dog who had arrived barely able to stand, let alone trust. "I think Scout knew before we did. He saw something in Gunner that we couldn't see at first. Sometimes, I think Scout understands more about healing than we do," Olivia said thoughtfully. "He knows exactly what each new animal needs, when to approach, when to back off, how to show them that it's safe to trust again." As if understanding her words, Scout glanced between them, his tail sweeping the porch boards in gentle acknowledgement. The simple normalcy of the moment, sitting together in the evening quiet, two dogs relaxed and at peace, struck Nate as nothing short of miraculous given where they had begun. The following months brought both challenges and triumphs for Second Chance Ranch. Word of their success with the Reeves dogs spread, bringing more cases, more volunteers, and thankfully, more donations. They expanded their facilities, adding a proper medical building and more rehabilitation spaces designed for dogs with specific needs. Gunner continued his remarkable progress, eventually becoming something of a lieutenant to Scout in the work with new arrivals. His size and calm presence seemed particularly effective with larger dogs who arrived defensive or fear-aggressive. Where Scout offered playful encouragement, Gunner provided steady reassurance, a beautiful balance that proved remarkably effective. As the criminal case against Reeves moved through the legal system, Nate worked closely with the district attorney, providing detailed testimony about Scout's condition when found, the evidence of systematic abuse, and the patterns observed across all the dogs rescued from Reeves's property. The process was draining but purposeful, each statement and piece of evidence another step toward justice. 6 months after Ellen's visit, on a crisp autumn morning, Nate stood in front of the courthouse, straightening his tie nervously. Today marked the beginning of Reeves's trial, and Nate was scheduled as one of the first witnesses. Scout sat beside him in a formal therapy dog vest, officially approved to accompany Nate to the stand as a demonstration of the rehabilitation possible with proper care. "Ready for this?" Olivia asked, joining them on the courthouse steps. She would manage the ranch while Nate testified, but had come to offer moral support before the proceedings began. Nate took a deep breath, drawing strength from Scout's solid presence beside him. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, the courtroom was already filling with spectators, local media, animal rights activists, and community members who had followed the case with interest. Nate spotted Dr. Jenkins and several volunteers from the ranch, their presence a welcome reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. The district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Michelle Patel, met them near the prosecution table. "Mr. Wilson, thank you for being here. We'll call you after opening statements, probably around mid-morning." Nate nodded, trying to quell the Butterflies in his stomach. This wasn't just about Scout anymore, or even about the 12 dogs rescued during the raid. This case had the potential to set precedents for how animal abuse was handled in their county, perhaps even statewide. As he took his seat in the gallery, Nate caught sight of Reeves entering with his attorney, still imposing in stature, but somehow diminished in the formal setting of the courtroom. Their eyes met briefly across the room, Reeves's gaze cold, with undisguised hatred. Beside Nate, Scout tensed slightly, sensing the presence of the man who had once hurt him so badly. "It's okay," Nate murmured, stroking Scout's ears gently. "He can't hurt you now." The trial opened with powerful statements from both sides, the prosecution outlining a pattern of deliberate cruelty masked as training, and the defense arguing that Reeves maintained acceptable standards for working dogs and was being persecuted by overzealous animal rights activists. The battle lines were clearly drawn from the beginning, each side presenting vastly different interpretations of the same evidence. When Nate was finally called to testify, Scout walked perfectly at heel beside him to the witness stand. The judge, having pre-approved Scout's presence, nodded in acknowledgement as they took their places. Under Ms. Patel's careful questioning, Nate recounted finding Scout that winter night, described his physical condition in clinical detail, and explained the rehabilitation process that had transformed the terrified, abused puppy into the confident therapy dog now sitting calmly beside him. "And in your professional opinion, Mr. Wilson," Ms. Patel asked, "were Scout's injuries consistent with accidents or neglect, or did they indicate deliberate mistreatment?" Nate met her gaze steadily. The pattern of scarring, particularly the circular burns and the wounds consistent with dogfighting, could only have been deliberately inflicted. No responsible trainer or handler would ever cause such injuries, accidentally or otherwise. The cross-examination was as aggressive as expected, Reeves's attorney attempting to paint Nate as an emotional animal rights extremist rather than a qualified professional. Throughout the hostile questioning, Scout remained a steady presence, occasionally leaning against Nate's leg as if offering support. When asked directly about his motivations for taking Scout that night, Nate answered, "Honestly, I knew what would happen to him if I followed protocol. He would have been deemed too traumatized, too damaged to rehabilitate with the resources available. I couldn't let that happen, not when I knew he deserved a chance." By the time Nate stepped down from the witness stand, he felt drained, but satisfied that he had spoken the truth clearly and convincingly. The photographs of Scout's condition when found, contrasted with current images of his healthy, thriving state, had visibly affected several jurors, exactly as Ellen had predicted. The trial continued for 2 weeks, with testimony from veterinarians, animal control officers, former employees of Reeves, and experts in canine behavior and forensic veterinary medicine. Throughout it all, Nate attended when he could, balancing his court appearances with his ongoing responsibilities at the ranch. At home, life continued its steady rhythm. Gunner, now fully rehabilitated, had been officially adopted by Nate, a decision that surprised no one who had witnessed their growing bond. He joined Scout in the ranch's therapy program, his calm demeanor particularly effective with the most traumatized new arrivals. On the final day of the trial, as closing arguments concluded and the jury retired to deliberate, Nate sat in the courthouse corridor with Scout and Olivia, mentally exhausted from the emotional intensity of the proceedings. "No matter what happens," Olivia said quietly, "you've already won the most important battle. Scout is safe, Gunner is safe. All those other dogs have found loving homes or are on their way to doing so. Reeves can never hurt them again." Nate nodded, grateful for her perspective. She was right, of course. The true victory wasn't in courtroom verdicts, but in transformed lives, both canine and human. When the jury returned after just 4 hours of deliberation, the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. As the forewoman read out guilty on multiple counts of animal cruelty, a wave of emotion swept through Nate. Relief, vindication, and a deep sense that a chapter was finally closing. The judge's sentencing was equally satisfying, a significant jail term, substantial fines, and a lifetime ban on owning or working with animals. While Reeves would undoubtedly appeal, the verdict sent a clear message about how such cases would be handled in the future. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and media, Nate knelt beside Scout, overcome with the journey they had traveled together. From a freezing puppy begging for shelter to a healing presence who had transformed countless lives, Scout's story had come full circle. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, pressing his forehead gently against Scout's. "We really did it." As cameras flashed around them, capturing the moment for news reports that would spread their story further, Nate thought about the frightened, shivering puppy he'd found outside the clinic that winter night. One split-second decision, one act of compassion in a moment of crisis, had set in motion changes neither of them could have imagined. Later that evening, standing on the porch of Second Chance Ranch with Scout and Gunner beside him, Nate gazed out at what they had built together, a place of healing, of second chances, of lives transformed. The lights of the main building glowed warmly, silhouetting the figures of staff tending to their charges, each animal on its own journey from fear to trust. A gentle snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, bringing Nate's thoughts full circle to that desperate night that had changed everything. Scout seemed to sense his reflection, pressing closer against his leg. In that way he had, a silent reminder of their connection. "Amazing, isn't it?" Nate mused aloud. "How sometimes the most important moments in our lives don't announce themselves. They just appear, asking us who we choose to be." Scout looked up at him with those soulful eyes that had once been so afraid to trust, now filled with complete confidence and love. In that gaze, Nate saw everything that mattered: the power of compassion, the possibility of healing, and the profound ways that saving another life could, in the end, save your own. 1 year after the successful trial against Victor Reeves, Second Chance Ranch had blossomed beyond anything Nate could have imagined. What had begun as a small rehabilitation center with a handful of animals had grown into a nationally recognized facility specializing in the recovery of severely traumatized dogs. Their success stories had been featured in veterinary journals, animal welfare publications, and even a documentary series about animal rehabilitation. The crisp autumn morning found Nate walking the perimeter of their newest addition, a training center designed specifically for working with reactive dogs. The modern building stood in stark contrast to the converted farmhouse where everything had begun, its design informed by years of hands-on experience with animals recovering from abuse. Scout trotted happily beside him, now a distinguished 5-year-old with subtle touches of gray appearing around his muzzle. Despite his age, he remained the heart and soul of the ranch, personally greeting each new arrival and seemingly assessing their needs with an uncanny accuracy that still amazed even the most seasoned staff members. Gunner followed at a more measured pace, his powerful frame moving with the dignified confidence he had developed over the past year. Once deemed potentially too damaged for rehabilitation, he had become one of their greatest success stories, and Nate's devoted companion. The Chocolate Lab now worked primarily with the most severely traumatized newcomers, his calm presence somehow communicating to them that recovery was possible. "What do you think, guys?" Nate asked, pausing to survey the nearly completed facility. "Ready for the grand opening next week?" Both dogs looked up at him with attentive expressions that always made Nate smile. He sometimes caught himself having full conversations with them, especially during quiet moments like this. The staff teased him about it good-naturedly, but everyone at the ranch understood the profound connection he shared with these particular animals who had changed the course of his life. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Nate's attention. Olivia was making her way toward them, clipboard in hand, her usual efficient demeanor softened by obvious excitement. "The final inspection is complete," she announced, her breath clouding in the cool morning air. "We passed with flying colors. We're officially cleared to open the training center next Monday." Nate exhaled with relief. The new facility represented not only a significant expansion of their work, but also the culmination of everything they had learned about animal rehabilitation over the past years. Every detail had been carefully considered, from soundproofed walls to prevent overwhelming nervous dogs, to specially designed lighting that could be adjusted for animals sensitive to brightness, to flooring materials chosen specifically for their non-threatening texture and sound. "Any word on the Jackson grant application?" Nate asked, falling into step beside Olivia as they continued their circuit of the building. She nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "That's the other news. We got it. All of it. Full funding for the outreach program for the next 3 years. The news was better than Nate had dared to hope. The Jackson Foundation was notoriously selective, funding only the most promising animal welfare initiatives. Their grant would allow Second Chance to launch a comprehensive program training rural veterinarians and animal control officers in the detection and documentation of animal abuse, potentially preventing countless cases from escalating to the severity they so often encountered. "That's incredible," Nate said, the implications slowly sinking in. "With that kind of backing, we could really change how these cases are handled from the beginning." "Exactly," Olivia agreed. "Prevention instead of just rehabilitation, though we'll always need both." As they completed their walk around the building, Nate found himself reflecting on how far they had come. From that split-second decision to rescue a freezing puppy on a winter night to creating a sanctuary that had helped hundreds of animals and influenced animal welfare practices. Across the state, the journey seemed almost unbelievable. They were approaching the main facility when Nate spotted an unfamiliar vehicle turning into the long driveway. This wasn't unusual. The ranch regularly received visitors, from potential adopters to veterinary students observing their techniques. But something about this particular car caught Nate's attention. It moved hesitantly, as if the driver was uncertain or nervous. "Were we expecting anyone this morning?" he asked Olivia, who consulted her ever-present clipboard. "Not until the volunteer orientation at 11, she replied, squinting at the approaching vehicle. "That's not one of our regulars." The car parked in the visitors area, and after a moment's pause, a woman emerged. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and a hesitant demeanor that suggested discomfort or uncertainty. She stood beside her car for several long moments, seemingly gathering courage, before slowly making her way toward them. Scout, typically friendly with visitors, pressed closer to Nate's side, his posture alert but not alarmed. Gunner, more naturally cautious with strangers, positioned himself slightly ahead, watching the approaching woman with careful attention. "Can we help you?" Nate called as she drew nearer, offering a welcoming smile. The woman stopped a respectful distance away, her eyes moving from Nate to the dogs and back again. "Are you Nathan Wilson?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady. Nate nodded, a flicker of curiosity rising. "Yes, that's me." "My name is Margaret Reeves," she said quietly. "Victor Reeves was my brother." The statement hit Nate like a physical blow. Victor Reeves, the man who had abused Scout and countless other animals, who had fought them in court with vicious determination, who was currently serving his sentence for animal cruelty, was connected to this nervous woman standing before them. Beside him, Olivia had gone completely still, her expression carefully neutral. Scout pressed tighter against Nate's leg, perhaps sensing his sudden tension. Even Gunner seemed to respond to the name, his ears flattening briefly before returning to their alert position. "I understand if you want me to leave," Margaret continued quickly, reading their reactions. "But I've been following the work you're doing here, and I needed to come to see for myself." Nate took a deep breath, reminding himself that this woman was not her brother. "Why don't we go inside?" he suggested, gesturing toward the main building. "It's getting chilly out here." Margaret nodded gratefully, following them to the administration building where Nate led her to the small conference room. Scout and Gunner accompanied them, settling near Nate's chair with the practiced ease of dogs accustomed to meetings. "Can I get you some coffee?" Olivia offered, her initial wariness giving way to professional courtesy. "Yes, thank you," Margaret replied, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Olivia stepped out, Margaret's eyes settled on Scout, studying him with an intensity that made Nate instinctively protective. "Is that—" she began, then paused. "Is that the dog my brother had? The one that started all this?" Nate nodded, resting his hand on Scout's head. "Yes, this is Scout, and this is Gunner, who was also rescued from your brother's property." Margaret's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. They looked so healthy, happy. She wiped at her eyes with an embarrassed gesture. "I'm sorry, this is more emotional than I expected." "May I ask why you're here, Ms. Reeves?" Nate asked, gently, as Olivia returned with coffee for their visitor. Margaret took the offered cup with a murmured thanks, using the moment to compose herself. "I cut ties with Victor years ago," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "His treatment of animals was just one symptom of a larger pattern of cruelty. I couldn't stand by anymore, especially after—" She trailed off, then visibly steeled herself. "Especially after I realized he was repeating patterns from our childhood." She set her cup down carefully, her hands still trembling, slightly. "When Victor was arrested, I followed the case in the news. I saw what you built here because of what happened with Scout. It's remarkable." Nate remained silent, sensing there was more to her story. Margaret seemed to be working up to something, each word carefully chosen. "After the trial, I started looking through our family records. Our grandfather's property, where Victor kept his dogs, has been in the family for generations. I'm the legal owner now, with Victor incarcerated." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'd like to donate it to Second Chance Ranch." The offer was so unexpected that Nate found himself momentarily speechless. The Reeves property comprised over 80 acres of land adjacent to their current facility, prime real estate that would allow them to expand their operations significantly. "That's extremely generous," he managed finally. "But may I ask why?" Margaret met his gaze directly for the first time. "Redemption, Mr. Wilson. Not for Victor. I don't know if that's possible, but for the land itself. That property has seen so much suffering. I'd like it to be part of healing instead." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder of documents. "I've had my lawyer draw up the preliminary paperwork. There are no conditions attached to the donation except one, that you rename the creek that runs through the property. It's currently called Reeves Creek, but I'd prefer something more fitting to its new purpose." Nate exchanged a quick glance with Olivia, whose expression reflected his own surprise and cautious optimism. "We'd need our board to review this, of course," he said carefully, "and there would be legal considerations." "Of course," Margaret nodded. "I don't expect an answer today, but I wanted to see this place for myself to make sure it was the right decision." Her eyes moved to Scout again, something like wonder crossing her features. "Seeing what you've accomplished here, I have no doubts." After Margaret's departure, with the promise of further discussions through their respective lawyers, Nate found himself standing at the large window overlooking the main rehabilitation area. The afternoon sun illuminated the scene. Volunteers, working with recovering dogs, staff conducting gentle training sessions, several fully rehabilitated animals enjoying supervised playtime. "What are you thinking?" Olivia asked, joining him at the window. Nate shook his head slightly, still, processing the unexpected encounter. "I'm thinking about circles, how things come around in ways we never could have predicted." Scout pressed against his leg, a familiar gesture of connection that always grounded Nate in moments of uncertainty. Looking down at his faithful companion, once a terrified, freezing puppy begging for help outside a clinic door, Nate felt the full weight of their journey together. The property where Scout was abused could become an extension of the sanctuary that his rescue inspired, he mused. There's something profoundly right about that. Olivia nodded thoughtfully. Healing the land as well as the animals. "I like it." She glanced at her watch. "The volunteer orientation is starting soon. Want me to handle it so you can process all this?" "No," Nate decided, squaring his shoulders. "I'd like to be there. Every new person who joins us is part of Scout's legacy, whether they realize it or not." The orientation room was filled with prospective volunteers, 23 people of varying ages and backgrounds, all drawn by the ranch's reputation and mission. Nate stood at the front with Scout and Gunner beside him, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with sharing their story. "Welcome to Second Chance Ranch," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I'm Nate Wilson, and these are my dogs, Scout and Gunner. Their stories are why we're all here today." As Nate recounted finding Scout that frigid winter night, the terrible condition he was in, and the long journey of rehabilitation, he watched understanding dawn on the faces before him. This wasn't just another animal rescue operation. It was a place of transformation, both for the animals and for the humans who worked with them. "What we do here isn't easy," he continued. "The animals who come to us have often experienced the worst of humanity. Our job is to show them the best, to prove to them one day at a time that trust is possible again." He glanced down at Scout, who sat attentively at his side, the perfect embodiment of resilience and recovery. "It's painstaking work. Progress is measured in tiny increments, a tail that wags for the first time, eyes that can maintain contact. For a few seconds longer, a dog who finally feels safe enough to sleep deeply." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "What made you take that risk, bringing Scout home when you knew it could cost you your job?" It was a question Nate had been asked countless times, yet he still paused to consider his answer. Carefully. In that moment, looking at him shivering in the snow, I didn't see a policy violation or a career risk. I just saw a living being who deserved a chance. Sometimes compassion demands action, even when that action comes with consequences. The orientation continued with Olivia covering the practical aspects of volunteering, schedules, training, requirements, the emotional resilience needed for the work. Throughout, Nate observed the prospective volunteers, noting those who seemed to truly grasp the depth of commitment required. Not everyone would return after their trial period, but those who did would become part of something transformative. After the session concluded, as the visitors were being taken on a tour of the facilities, Nate stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the property as Scout and Gunner explored the familiar territory of the garden. His phone buzzed with a notification, an email from their lawyer confirming the preliminary review of Margaret Reeves's offer. The property donation appeared legitimate, with no hidden complications. The expansion could become reality within months. As Nate contemplated what this would mean for their work, Dr. Jenkins approached, her expression unusually solemn. "Got a minute? There's something you should see." She led him to the medical building where a new arrival was being examined. A small mixed-breed dog with injuries consistent with dogfighting. The animal trembled violently on the examination table, eyes wide with terror, flinching at every movement around him. "He was found wandering near the highway," Dr. Jenkins explained quietly. "No microchip, no collar. Based on his injuries, he was likely used as a bait dog. Animal control brought him straight here because of our experience with these cases." Nate studied the frightened dog with a practiced eye, noting the pattern of wounds, the defensive posture, the way he tucked his tail so tightly it nearly disappeared. The signs were heartbreakingly familiar. This animal had known nothing but cruelty at human hands. "What do you think?" Dr. Jenkins asked. "Is he too far gone?" "Some of the staff are concerned he might be too traumatized for rehabilitation." Nate thought back to Scout's early days. The crippling fear, the inability to trust, the long nights spent simply existing in the same space, building connection through patient presence. He thought of Gunner, once deemed impossible to rehabilitate, now helping other traumatized animals find their way back to trust. "No one is too far gone," he said firmly. "No one." As if sensing the topic of conversation, Scout approached the examination table cautiously. Though careful not to startle the new arrival, he didn't retreat from the frightened dog's defensive growl. Instead, he settled a few feet away, his posture relaxed and non-threatening, his eyes occasionally meeting the newcomers with a calm that seemed to say, "I understand. I've been where you are." Dr. Jenkins watched this interaction with a smile. "He still amazes me, even after all these years. It's like he knows exactly what they need." "He does," Nate agreed. "Better than any of us." Later that evening, as the ranch settled into its nighttime routine, Nate sat on the porch of his small house on the property, Scout and Gunner resting contentedly nearby. The stars emerged one by one in the clear autumn sky, the distant sounds of the animals in their comfortable enclosures creating a peaceful backdrop. He thought about the day's events, Margaret's unexpected visit and generous offer, the hopeful new volunteers, the terrified dog in the medical building just beginning. His journey toward trust. Each represented a different facet of the work they did, the ripples spreading outward from that first courageous decision in a snowstorm. Scout stirred, rising to stretch before padding over to rest his head on Nate's knee, a gesture that had become a comforting ritual between them. Looking into those soulful eyes, Nate marveled at how this one dog had changed the direction of his entire life. "You know," he said softly, scratching behind Scout's ears, "I always thought I was the one who saved you that night. But the truth is you saved me too." Scout's tail wagged gently, his expression serene in the gathering darkness. Gunner moved closer as well, settling his substantial weight against Nate's legs with a contented sigh. These moments of quiet connection were Nate's daily reminder of why their work mattered, because every animal deserved to know this feeling of safety, of belonging, of trust freely given. The following week brought the official opening of the new training center, an event attended by supporters, media, and even a few celebrities known for their animal welfare advocacy. As Nate stood before the gathered crowd, Scout and Gunner faithfully at his side, he felt a profound sense of both accomplishment and humility. "When I found Scout freezing in the snow 5 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive audience, "I had no idea that one decision would lead to all of this. I was just a veterinary technician who couldn't leave a suffering animal to die in the cold." He glanced down at Scout, whose attentive posture and bright eyes showed no trace of the traumatized puppy he had once been. "Some people have asked if I knew even then that he was special. The truth is, every animal is special. Every one of them deserves the chance to heal, to trust again, to live without fear." The crowd applauded as Nate cut the ceremonial ribbon, officially opening the facility that would help countless more animals recover from trauma and abuse. As photographers captured the moment, Nate knelt beside Scout and Gunner, grateful beyond words for their presence in his life. The celebration continued throughout the day, with tours of the new facility, demonstrations of their rehabilitation techniques, and stories of successful adoptions shared by families who had opened their homes to second-chance graduates. Several formerly unadoptable dogs, now thriving in loving homes, returned for the occasion, their transformations providing powerful testimony to the effectiveness of the ranch's methods. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Nate found himself drawn to the small memorial garden they had created near the main building. Here, stones etched with the names of animals who hadn't survived their injuries created a quiet space for reflection, a reminder of why their work mattered and why they must continue to fight against animal cruelty. Scout followed, seemingly understanding Nate's need for this moment of contemplation. Together, they walked among the memorial stones, honoring the lives that had been lost, but not forgotten. "There will always be more work to do," Nate murmured. More to himself than to Scout. More animals to save, more minds to change. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Olivia joined them in the garden, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the peaceful space. "The board just finished their meeting," she said. "They've unanimously approved accepting Margaret Reeves' property donation. The paperwork should be finalized within the month." Nate nodded, a mixture of emotions washing over him. "And the creek? Did they decide on a new name?" A smile touched Olivia's lips. "Yes, if you approve, it will be renamed Scouts Creek. They thought it fitting that the waterway running through both properties should bear the name of the dog who inspired all of this." The suggestion caught Nate by surprise, emotion tightening his throat as he looked down at Scout, who seemed blissfully unaware of this honor. "I think that's perfect," he managed finally. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The day's excitement had given way to a quieter satisfaction, a recognition of how far they had come and the journey still ahead. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if you hadn't found Scout that night," Olivia mused. "If you'd walked to your car without hearing him, or if you'd followed protocol and brought him to the shelter." Nate shook his head. "I can't imagine it. That moment, finding him, making that choice, it feels like everything my life was leading toward without my knowing it." As darkness settled over the ranch, lights came on in the various buildings where night staff continued the round-the-clock care of their most vulnerable residents. The steady rhythm of the sanctuary continued. Medicines administered, comfort offered, trust slowly built through consistent gentleness. Nate, Scout, and Gunner made their final rounds for the evening, checking on the newest arrivals and offering encouragement to the dedicated staff working the overnight shift. In the medical building, they stopped to observe the frightened bait dog who had arrived earlier that week. Although still wary, he had begun taking food directly from his caretaker's hands. A small but significant victory. "He's going to make it," Nate told the concerned overnight technician. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Small steps, consistent kindness." Back at his house, as Nate prepared for bed, he found himself drawn to the window overlooking the property. The ranch lay peaceful under the starlight, a sanctuary carved out of determination and compassion. Soon it would expand, reaching more animals, training more professionals, spreading its influence further. Scout and Gunner settled into their beds nearby, their presence a constant reminder of resilience and the healing power of trust. As Nate watched them drift into peaceful sleep, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From a freezing puppy begging for help to the inspiration for a nationally recognized rehabilitation center, Scout's story had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of hundreds of animals and the humans who loved them. Each new day brought challenges, but also opportunities to extend that legacy of healing. Nate thought of the frightened dog in the medical building, just beginning his journey toward trust. He thought of the property that would soon become part of their sanctuary, transformed from a place of suffering to a place of healing. He thought of all the animals still out there, waiting to be found, waiting for their second chance. One rescue had created ripples that continued to spread outward, touching more lives than he could count. One moment of compassion in a snowstorm had grown into something that would outlast all of them. As Nate finally turned away from the window, Scout lifted his head sleepily, eyes finding Nate's in the darkness. In that quiet exchange of glances was everything that needed to be said: gratitude, trust, and the profound bond that forms when two lives save each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need, new battles against cruelty and indifference. But tonight, in this peaceful moment, Nate allowed himself to simply appreciate how far they had come. From desperate survival to purposeful thriving, from a split-second decision to a lifetime commitment. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, a gentle reminder of where their journey had begun and the countless journeys of healing still to come. In that simple weather pattern was a perfect symmetry. Winter returning, but this time bringing not desperation but hope. Not an ending, but a continuing promise of renewal. Scout settled back into his bed with a contented sigh, secure in the knowledge that he was safe, he was home, and his legacy would continue to grow with each new animal who found refuge at Second Chance Ranch. The frightened puppy begging for help in a snowstorm had become something remarkable. A living testament to resilience, to the healing power of compassion, and to the extraordinary difference that one act of kindness can make in a cold and sometimes cruel world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.